Phantasy Star is a series of console role-playing video games and other supplementary media created by Sega. The series debuted in 1987 on the Sega Master System with Phantasy Star, and continues into the present with Phantasy Star Online 2 and other extensions of the Phantasy Star Online sub-series. Each of the games in the series features a science fantasy setting featuring a cross-genre combination of magic and technology. The first 4 games in the series are set in or related to the fictional planetary system of Elgol, and are single-player RPGs. Later titles bearing the Phantasy Star name are for the most part massively multiplayer online games. Phantasy Star Online and Phantasy Star Universe are set in other galaxies, sharing minor canonical links with the original series, mostly in the recurrence of common themes and antagonists. Original series. The original series takes place in the Elgol solar system, which consists of 4 planets. Palma, a fertile agricultural world; Motavia, a desert planet; Desirus, an ice planet; and the mysterious Ricris, whose elongated orbit brings it within visible range only once every 1,000 years. Players travel to all 4 planets throughout the series, interacting with each unique set of inhabitants and discovering the secrets to the solar system's genesis, which is irrevocably tied to an ancient conflict. Phantasy Star was the first installment of the series, released for the Sega Master System in Japan on December 20, 1987, and then in the United States in 1988. It introduced players to the planets, races, and lore of the series. The game follows the adventures of Alice Landale, a young woman from Palma and notably one of the genre's first female protagonists. After Alice's brother Nero is killed by the formerly benevolent government of King Lassic, Alice embarks upon a quest for revenge. She is joined in her rebellion by a musk cat named Mayor, a warrior named Odin, and a wizard named Noah. Together, the group defeats Lassic, but discover that he was only being controlled by the malevolent entity Dark Falls. Alice and her companions defeat Dark Falls and restore peace to Elgol. Phantasy Star 2, released in March 1989, marked the series' transition to the Sega Genesis. It benefited from an upgrade in graphics and in the scope of its quests, as it's more than twice the size of its predecessor. It tells the story of Rolf, a government agent from the town of Paseo on Motavia. In this new setting, 1,000 years after Phantasy Star, Motavia is no longer a desert world, but has been mostly converted into one lush with vegetation and animal life, thanks to a system-wide computer network known as Mother Brain. However, malfunctions throughout the network are resulting in all sorts of catastrophes, from climate change to the appearance of mutant plant and animal life called biomonsters. Rolf changes from an agent of the government to a rebel fated to end Mother Brain's reign over the system. He is joined by a colorful cast of characters, all of whom have their own stakes in the conflict. Beset by the biomonsters at first and government-deployed robots afterward, Rolf and his allies eventually must fight both Dark Force, the enemy from 1,000 years ago, and the Mother Brain. Phantasy Star 3, Generations of Doom, released for the Mega Drive in 1990 and on the Genesis in 1991, was a departure from the previous games in that the different worlds were no longer the different planets of the Elgol system. The game revolves around 2 feuding factions, the Orakians and the Layans, who have been engaged in bitter conflict since their founders disappeared 1,000 years earlier. The factions assume their founders were bitter enemies, who fought each other. Unique to Phantasy Star 3 was a storyline that spanned 3 generations, starting with Reese, an Orakian, and continues through 2 more generations, with the player controlling Reese's son and grandchildren. At the end of each generation, the player determines the next main character by choosing which of the women encountered during the adventure the characters will marry. Reese and his children eventually discover the true nature of the world and the conflict, that the 7 worlds were actually subsections of the colony ship Eliza 3 sent into deep space after the destruction of Palm. Somehow Dark Force was able to accompany the fleeing colonists and work to turn them against each other. Riz grandchild or grandchildren defeat Dark Force to restore peace to Eliza 3. Phantasy Star IV. Phantasy Star IV. The End of the Millennium was released for the Mega Drive in Japan in November 1993, in the United States in February 1995, and in Europe in December 1995. Building on its predecessors, it added a number of new features, such as pre-programmable combat maneuvers called macros, combination attacks between two or more characters, and manga-style panel illustrations for major cutscenes. It was also the first game in the series to have in-depth character interaction and development. Taking place 1,000 years after Phantasy Star 2, Phantasy Star IV returns to the algal solar system, which has been in a precipitous decline after the destruction of Mother Brain, an event known as the Great Collapse. The people struggle to survive against an unforgiving climate and a resurgence of biomonsters. Amongst them are Chaz Ashley and his mentor Alice Brangwyn, hunters who make a living performing various tasks for clients, from protecting citizens from monster attacks to investigating strange events. As seemingly random occurrences all tie back into the system-wide crisis, Chaz and the allies he meets during his quest must fulfill the series' promise of fighting back the re-emergence of darkness. However, in this, the end of the original series, players will not only face off against the incarnation of evil, but penetrate to its very source, to rescue Algal once and for all from a bleak fate. Compilations and remakes. The popularity of Phantasy Star in both the East and West prompted Sega to re-release the games of the original series, both within larger game compilations, and in standalone enhanced remakes. Phantasy Star Collection. Phantasy Star Collection is a compilation of the 4 games from the original series, released in 1998 only in Japan on the Sega Saturn, as part of the Sega Ages series. It also includes full motion videos of the original television commercials for the games and 215 pieces of official art. A Game Boy Advance version, produced by Digital Eclipse, was released for international audiences in 2002. This version omits Phantasy Star IV, the full motion videos, and the art gallery. 3 of the 4 games were released again on the PlayStation 2 as part of the Sega Genesis Collection, and all 4 appeared on Sonic's Ultimate Genesis Collection for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 consoles. This compilation includes special features such as behind-the-scenes information, and the ability to save the game anywhere. Phantasy Star Generation 1. Phantasy Star Generation 1 is an enhanced remake of Phantasy Star, released in 2003 for the PlayStation 2, as Volume 1 of the Sega Ages series. It features newly designed graphics, arranged versions of music from the original game's soundtrack, and fleshed-out dialogue, which results in both character development and a richer story. Phantasy Star Generation 2. Phantasy Star Generation 2 was released in 2005, also for the PlayStation 2, and is an enhanced remake of Phantasy Star 2, and is Volume 17 of the Ages series. It mirrors the events of the original game while adding character development and fleshing out the story in more detail. It features enhanced graphics, a revised combat system, and a rearranged soundtrack. Spin-offs. These games were tangents from the original series, in some cases featuring characters from those games, and in others following storylines only loosely connected to the main continuum. They were released for their respective systems only in Japan. Phantasy Star Gaiden, released in 1992 for the Game Gear, is a spin-off of the original Phantasy Star and takes place on a colony known as Copto, founded by the heroine Alice Landale. In this new setting, Alice is once again called upon to battle evil, now in the form of a being known as Carburan, which she is able to seal away. The majority of the game then follows the adventures of new characters, Minina and Alec, some 400 years later until they reunite with Alice, who had been in cryogenic sleep in a vigil against Carburan's return. After Copto is saved, the game foreshadows the re-emergence of evil back in Algol in Phantasy Star 2. Phantasy Star Adventure is a first-person puzzle-adventure game released in 1992 for the Game Gear prior to Phantasy Star Gaiden. Taking place at the same time as Phantasy Star 2, it puts the players in the shoes of an agent of Paseo. He receives a letter from friend and scientist, Ken Miller, who is studying on the ice planet Desolise and invites him to see an important new invention. Once there, the player learns that Ken and his device are missing, initiating an investigation. Phantasy Star 2 Text Adventures were a series of 8 text-adventure video games available to users of Sega MegaNet, a modem for the Sega Mega Drive in Japan, and later released as part of a compilation on Sega CD. Each of the games takes place shortly before Phantasy Star 2, documenting the backgrounds of its characters and explaining what brings them to the town Paseo, where they eventually team up to investigate the pervasive troubles of the Algol solar system. Phantasy Star Online. Phantasy Star Online is a series of online RPGs originally released for Dreamcast in 2000, and continuing on the Xbox, Nintendo GameCube, and Microsoft Windows. Phantasy Star Online started a new adventure, centering on the plight of a colony of spaceships called Pioneer 2, in another star system. Players fight through a number of levels spread over 4 distinct areas, finally facing off against Dark Fowls, a nod to the original series. In addition to the main story, players can also take the Hunters Guild side quests, which explores the lives of Pioneer 2's citizens, and further delve into the backstory behind the game. In the tradition of MMORPGs, these side quests reward players with Miseta, the chance to explore the stories behind Pioneer 2's NPC residents, and the opportunity to obtain special weapons. Phantasy Star Online Episode 1 and 2. Phantasy Star Online Episode 1 and 2 was not a simple port of the Dreamcast game. It included a brand new episode not available in the original Dreamcast version. The game was released for the Nintendo GameCube and Xbox in 2002, and introduced several new features, such as multiplayer split-screen mode, 3 new character classes, game rebalancing, reduced experience point requirements, class recalibration, and 5 newly explorable areas. Phantasy Star Online Episode 3. CARD. Revolution. Phantasy Star Online Episode 3. CARD. Revolution, released only for the Nintendo GameCube, marked yet another departure from series establishments, featuring a card-based playstyle. Taking place 21 years after Episode 1 and Episode 2, follows the people of Pioneer 2 as they continue their settlement on the planet Raggle. The government, amidst inner strife, seeks to use a mysterious substance discovered on the planet, known as the Germ, to power the newly developed compressed alternate reality data technology. Players take on the roles of both agents appointed by the government to explore, research, and capture the rebel elements, or the ARKZ. Rebel elements themselves trying to intercept and destroy the government's plans for the exploitation of the planet. Phantasy Star Online Episode 4. Blue Burst. Released exclusively for Microsoft Windows, Episode 4 was an expansion of Episode 1 and Episode 2, and a return to the PSO's hack-and-slash format. It features new enemies, maps, and items, in addition to those included with previous episodes. The new maps include crater routes, crater interior, and subterranean desert. Phantasy Star Online 2. Phantasy Star Online 2 is an MMORPG first released for Microsoft Windows on July 4, 2012, and later PlayStation Vita, Android and iOS. Action role-playing games. Phantasy Star Universe. Phantasy Star Universe is an action role-playing game by Sega's Sonic team for the PC, PlayStation 2, and Xbox 360. It more closely follows the series' new direction as set by Phantasy Star Online, mostly played in a persistent online network mode, but unlike its predecessor, featured a more robust single-player story mode. The game is set in the Sega Star System, which consists of 3 planets, each with its own unique culture and inhabitants. After the final conflict, a war ending 100 years ago, a union was formed between the 3 planets, leading to the establishment of the Allied Army. During a celebration of the peace accord, a meteor shower facilitates the invasion of the 3 planets by Seed, a race of strange monsters. The game revolves around Ethan Weber, a member of an elite soldier force called the Guardians, which must rally against the new threat. Phantasy Star Universe. Ambition of the Illuminus is an expansion pack for Phantasy Star Universe, featuring new enemies, weapons, levels, and cities. Ambition of the Illuminus continues the story online with the player's personal avatar. Now the central character, he or she will investigate and work to restore peace in the chaotic Sega system. The player investigates through a series of single-player missions, meeting familiar characters like Ethan Weber. The multiplayer world was greatly expanded with new missions and dungeons. Phantasy Star Portable. Phantasy Star Zero. Phantasy Star Zero is a third-person action RPG developed by Sonic Team exclusively for the Nintendo DS. The game was released in Japan on December 25, 2008 and in North America on November 10, 2009, and has been released in Europe on February 12, 2010. The game shares gameplay mechanics and themes from previous Phantasy Star Online titles, particularly Phantasy Star Universe. Phantasy Star Nova. Phantasy Star Nova is a third-person action RPG developed by Tri-Ace exclusively for the PlayStation Vita, released on November 27, 2014 in Japan. The game's setting involves the crash landing of an ARC's special planetary exploration ship on the planet Machia, where photons have no effect. Common elements. The plot, setting, and themes of the Phantasy Star series vary dramatically from the franchise's early installments to the multiplayer titles of today. Phantasy Star, Phantasy Star 2, and Phantasy Star IV all deal with the concept of evil as a living, sentient entity that takes an active interest in galactic events. A being known as Dark Force plagues the algal planetary system every 1,000 years, resulting in mass destruction and loss of life. It begins its campaign of terror in subtle ways, usually subverting others to its will. Only once its pawn has either been eliminated or is no longer useful does Dark Force ever reveal itself. With each incarnation of Dark Force, a group of protectors arise to suppress it, ushering in a period of recovery and prosperity for the algal system. This cycle of complacency and destruction continues every millennium. In Phantasy Star IV, the source of this being known as the Profound Darkness appears as well. The original series takes place in the algal system, with 3 major planets: Palma, Motavia, and Desolise. Palma is destroyed during the events of Phantasy Star 2, when the prison satellite Gera crashes into the planet. Several colony ships fled from the disaster, and one of those ships, the Eliza 3, is the setting of Phantasy Star 3. Other locations within the series include several artificial satellites and Rykris, a planet with an extremely elongated orbit. Phantasy Star Online and Phantasy Star Universe take place in different planetary systems. Fictional races that reoccur in the series include sentient androids created by humans, called castes in the spin-off series and portable games, and Newmans, previously called Newmans, elf-like humanoids created by genetically engineering DNA from humans and other genetically engineered biomonsters. Development history. The original Phantasy Star was released for the Sega Master System in Japan on December 20, 1987. It was one of the earliest cartridges to include battery-backed RAM for saving game positions. The game featured 3D maze-like dungeons, which players traversed in a first-person mode. Phantasy Star, along with Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, distinguished itself as a pioneer of what came to be defined as console role-playing. The first 4 games take place in the same universe, as opposed to many RPG series such as Final Fantasy, wherein successive game settings are unrelated, or, at most, superficially related. Each major Phantasy Star game adds on to the series' overall story, culminating in Phantasy Star IV, which ties all of the series' plot elements together. Both Phantasy Star Online and Phantasy Star Universe are their own series based on the original Phantasy Star games. They continue the theme of a persistent game universe, but are set in different planetary systems than the original games.